A very good afternoon, everyone. Greetings on behalf of KIMS Cuddles Online Neonatal Education Initiative. I hope I am audible and
Yeah.
could you kindly confirm that you're all able to see the screen? Yeah, I can see a lot of responses as it is audible, right? So thanks everyone for joining us again today. We will begin with a brief recap of what we had discussed last time. So we began with the objectives of mechanical ventilation. We discussed that the objective of ventilation is to improve oxygenation and CO2 elimination. This is achievable by regulating mean airway pressure and FiO2 for oxygenation and by improving the minute ventilation and respiratory rate for CO2 elimination. For CO2 elimination, in addition to these two principles, we also have to consider the endotracheal tube determinants, such as the depth, the length of the endotracheal tube, the diameter of the endotracheal tube, presence or absence of secretions, and increased dead space volume. So we discussed also that there are 6 main players when it comes to the settings in any mode of mechanical ventilation. 2 of them are kind of determined by the severity of disease, irrespective of whatever disease might be the underlying etiology for ventilation, and these are PIP and FiO2. The other 4 players, which are kind of decided by the disease that we are dealing and the size and the weight of the baby, are the peak end expiratory pressure, the I time, respiratory rate, and the flow. So we also discussed that each of these variables is decided by a few specific pulmonary mechanics related variables. For example, the PEEP is decided by the functional residual capacity of the baby's disease. So in a low FRC condition, we need to give adequate PEEP, high PEEP. In a high FRC condition like meconium aspiration syndrome, we need to give a low to moderate PEEP. The I time is determined by the time constant, and time constant is a product of compliance and resistance. The respiratory rate, we said, is determined by the weight of the baby as well as the work of breathing. More the work of breathing, more will be the rate. Smaller the weight of the baby, higher will be the respiratory rate. Similarly, the flow on mechanical ventilator is also determined by the minute ventilation. So the minimum flow that needs to be set, we discussed, is 5 times minute ventilation plus at least 2 liters per minute for accounting for circuit losses. The other two parameters, PIP and FiO2, usually vary based on the severity of the underlying disease. The PIP being more if the baby has lesser compliance. So compliance determines the PIP required, and the FiO2 is determined by the AADO2 or the arterial alveolar oxygenation gradient. So for each of these parameters, we decided that these are further titrated based on some clinical and blood gas as well as radiological parameters that we see to determine the adequacy of ventilation. So typically when we look at pulmonary graphics. Similarly, PEEP, the adequacy is determined by the presence of retractions and by the oxygenation, the saturation, which should be targeted to be between 91 to 95%, and likewise the lung volume on the chest X-ray. So TI, clinically, it is difficult to determine adequacy, but after the chest moves up completely, it needs to remain there for at least few milliseconds before the chest again moves down. And the adequacy of I time will be also determined by the ability to deliver this set peak inspiratory pressure. Respiratory rate adequacy is determined by the degree of synchrony. So greater the asynchrony, more is the need for a higher respiratory rate. So we also discussed that there are different modes of ventilation, and the three primary variables that determine these three modes are the triggering variable, that is the variable that triggers the beginning of patient's inspiration and causes the ventilator breath to begin. Number 2, limiting or control variable. This is what regulates the maximum gas flow to the patient during every breath. And number 3, cycling variable. This is the variable that cycles the ventilator to move from inspiration to expiration. So this is what causes the inspiration to end and expiration to begin. So the trigger variable can be a signal from the patient, which can be either in the form of abdominal movement, thoracic movement, which can be sensed by the ECG leads. It can be in the form of flow, that is the negative inspiratory flow generated by the patient that can be sensed by a flow sensor, or it can be a pressure sensor, which determines the negative inspiratory pressure that is generated by the patient. The limiting variable commonly can be in the form of the pressure. This is set by the peak inspiratory pressure in pressure controlled ventilation or the target tidal volume in volume controlled ventilation. And cycling variable can be either time or flow. So in typical time cycle ventilation, the ventilator cycles from inspiration to expiration at the end of the I time. Or in flow cycle ventilation, as we will be discussing today, this is based on the patient flow. So we will begin with today's topic of discussion, which is patient-triggered modes of ventilation. So why are we discussing about PTV in the first place? Now, traditionally, when ventilation began, it was begun in the form of IMV or CMV. So in IMV or in CMV, IMV is intermittent mandatory ventilation, CMV is controlled mechanical ventilation. In both these modes, the ventilator used to deliver mandatory breaths at few fixed intervals of time, irrespective of whether the baby is breathing or not. So we saw this as well. So if you imagine that these red triangles indicate the baby's spontaneous breaths, so the rising part of the triangle indicates inspiration and this phase is the expiration. And these lines indicate the beginning of the patient's inspiration. IMV or CMV breaths used to look like this. So where ventilator used to just deliver few breaths at fixed random time intervals. And these need not necessarily be synchronized with the baby's breath. And as you can see here, in the first breath, there is a time lag between the beginning of patient's inspiration and the beginning of the ventilator's inspiration. This lack is called as inspiratory asynchrony. So this is lack of synchrony between the patient's inspiration and the ventilator's inspiration. Likewise, if you see the time at which the patient began expiration, it was at here, whereas the time at which the ventilator began expiration lies here. So this blue arrow mark actually denotes the difference in the time points between the patient's expiration and the ventilator's expiration. So this leads to expiratory asynchrony. Now, by chance, in the third ventilator breath, there is a random synchrony between the patient's and the ventilator's inspiration. So in IMV or CMV, asynchrony is generally considered as the norm, and synchrony, if at all it happens only by chance. And we all know that asynchrony in a ventilated baby can lead to a lot of harms. It can lead to ineffective gas exchange and ineffective ventilation, which can lead to increased work of breathing and risk of hypoxemia and hypercarbia. It can also lead to the generation of auto peep or inadvertent peep when the baby tries to exhale when the ventilator is still trying to deliver inspiration. It leads to the generation of auto peep. Likewise, when the patient has not finished expiration and even before that the next ventilator breath initiates, this can lead to the trapping of some gas flow in the baby's lungs. So this is associated with a higher risk of air leaks such as interstitial emphysema and pneumothorax. And the presence of asynchrony results in interference or fluctuations in cerebral blood flow, leading to the risk of IVH or PVL in a preterm baby. So typically, if one wants to overcome asynchrony in IMV or CMV, there are some strategies that may be followed. These include increasing the rates on the ventilator. So this is an attempt to capture the neonate's breath, and this is called as overdrive ventilation. So where you try and breathe with the ventilator faster than the baby in an attempt to reduce asynchrony. But this can lead to some problems. So when we increase the respiratory rate with the same I time, automatically we will compromise on the expiratory time or E time. So this can lead to the problem of inadvertent PEEP or auto PEEP due to air trapping and also increase the chance of lung injury. The other strategy to overcome asynchrony while still being on IMV would be increasing the pressure or increasing PIP. And this again, although it may transiently help us to overcome asynchrony, would result in harms like lung injury and result in higher risk of barotrauma and air leak syndromes like PIE and pneumothorax. And lastly, we sometimes resort to sedation with drugs like midazolam and paralysis, sometimes like atrocurium, in order to overcome asynchrony, which also comes with unacceptable side effects such as hypotension and respiratory depression. So the strategies to overcome asynchrony while still remaining on IMV mode come with a lot of problem, either in the form of increasing rates or increasing the pressures or using sedation or paralysis. So it is definitely wiser and more reasonable to resort to patient-triggered modes of ventilation, where the signal from the neonate that indicates to us that the patient has initiated a breath can be sensed by the ventilator, and the ventilator actually delivers an inspiratory or a ventilator breath which is synchronized to the patient. So this sensor detects the inspiratory effect of the neonate and signals the ventilator to initiate a breath. To do this, we need a sensor which kind of detects that the patient has initiated breathing. This can be in the form of thoracic impedance meters, which are used in which were used earlier with Seacrest ventilator, which is kind of no longer in use these days. So this uses the ECG leads to actually capture the thoracic movements of the baby. This may also be done with a applanation tonometer, which detects the abdominal movement of a newborn, also going by the name Graysby capsule, which was a part of another phased out ventilator by name Infant Star ventilator. Now, both these types of sensors are quite imprecise. They are quite insensitive also, because they require a significant patient effort for us to sense that the baby has initiated a breath, and hence the work of breathing of the baby can become more. Also, they can come with the problem of artifactual triggering due to non-respiratory efforts, non-respiratory movements of the baby, such as hiccups. And Grasby capsule as a principle requires the baby to have abdominothoracic pattern of breathing. So wherein there is kind of significant abdomen movement, which is sometimes more than the thoracic movement. Of course, this may be normal in newborn babies, but it is counterintuitive that the baby needs to have abdominothoracic movement for Grasby capsule to actually work. So the newer type of sensor mechanism is now predominantly limited to flow sensors. Flow sensors are of two types, the hot wire anemometer and the pneumotachometer. So the hot wire anemometer seen on the right side has number of heated electrical filaments, which based on the airflow across these heated filaments and the drop in temperature that results because of this, result in detecting the patient's flow. And this is considered as a more sensitive type of flow sensor. And the other type being the differential variable orifice type of flow sensor, which is also called as a pneumotachograph. So the hot wire anemometer is available with ventilators such as Draeger and SLE 6000, whereas the pneumotachograph is the type of flow sensor available with the Sophie Stephanie ventilator. The pneumotachogram relies on the principle of the flow from the patient passing through number of small tubes, like you can see here, of fixed radius and fixed length. So this results in fixed resistance across the tube, and the flow sensor actually determines the difference in pressure across these tubes, and this difference in pressure is translated into a flow. So flow is calculated from the delta P across these tubings and by knowing the fixed resistance in the tubing. The last type of sensor is the pressure transducer, as available in SLE 2000, which is used to detect the patient's negative inspiratory effort, which results in negative pressure in the ventilator tubing. That is used as the signal to detect the patient's inspiratory effort. So these are the relative response times and the advantages and disadvantages of different types of flow sensors, trigger sensors. We can see that both thoracic impedance sensors using the ECG leads and the abdomen motion sensors using the Grasby capsule are associated with a prolonged response time. So it takes a long time for us to actually sense that the baby has taken a breath from the time that the baby initiated breathing. But the advantages are that these are easy to use and there is not much risk of autocycling. But the disadvantages include that they cannot be used to measure the tidal volume. So only the flow sensor also helps us to measure the tidal volume in addition to functioning as a trigger sensor per se. So among the two flow sensors, the hot wire anemometer is resulting in even shorter response time. So it results in least asynchrony. But because it is so sensitive, it is also associated with a disadvantage called as autocycling. So there can be signals which, apart from the patient's inspiratory effort resulting in flow itself, can result in the flow sensor detecting a breath. So this commonly happens when the heated filaments of the hot wire anemometer sense the condensed water from the tubings as a signal which results in the drop of temperature in the electric filaments as a artifactual breath. So the condensate from the ventilator tubing, condensate of course is not normal, but sometimes we do encounter this problem while ventilating babies. So this condensate itself can result in artifactual triggering or autocycling, and this can result in the ventilator delivering a very high respiratory rate. The pressure transducers are typically seen with all SLE ventilators. So in SLE 2000, there is no flow sensor. So it only works on the pressure transducer. So here the negative pressure of the baby is used as the trigger sensor. The disadvantage is that a pressure sensor is relatively insensitive when compared to flow sensor. So it requires a higher patient effort for the pressure sensor to work as the trigger. So we discussed about the hot wire anemometers as well as the pneumotachograph. And as we discussed, the pneumotachograph relies on the principle that flow across the sensor is determined by delta pressure divided by the resistance offered by the sensor itself. So the principal advantages of the flow sensors are that in addition to functioning as a trigger sensor, they help in measuring the tidal volume. They also help us by measuring the flow to make flow cycled ventilation or pressure support ventilation possible. So this we will discuss in a while. So this helps us to improve the expiratory synchrony. And in flow sensors, we we may offer peritubal leak. That leaked gas flow is also sometimes sensed as a patient breath by the flow sensor. So in order to adjust for this, we may actually, try and make the trigger a little insensitive or make it a higher threshold so that artifactual triggering does not happen with the flow sensor. So how much must be the right trigger, or where do we actually set the trigger? This is an important question. Typically, most ventilation proponents believe that the trigger must be set at the lowest possible threshold in order to avoid auto-triggering. So if you look at a Draeger ventilator, the flow sensor is, the trigger is available on a scale of 10, from 1 to 10. So the lowest flow that is required for initiating a ventilator breath corresponds to the scale of 1, which corresponds to a flow of 0.2 liters per minute. So as low as 200 ml of flow can be sensed by the ventilator, and this can result in the initiation of a ventilator breath. So this is the least possible level, or the most sensitive trigger, you may say. So try to always have the trigger as at the most sensitive level, provided there is no auto triggering. If you find too much of auto triggering happening at the most sensitive trigger or the lowest possible level, both mean the same, then you may gradually increase the threshold. So from 0.2 liters per minute, you can make it 0.4 or 0.6 if you find that auto cycling is happening, and leave it at the level where you don't get any auto triggering and you only detect the genuine triggering of the baby. But also we must not keep it very high, otherwise it will make the trigger threshold very insensitive and the baby has to work very hard in order to be sensed by the trigger itself. So the important problems with the trigger sensor are the non-respiratory movements such as hiccups can be sometimes be detected as artifactual triggers, and there can be water vapor or peritubal leaks that result in auto cycling. And sometimes there can be failure to trigger, especially if the trigger has been set very high or if the patient has weak inspiratory efforts. So we have discussed different types of trigger sensors. The newest type of trigger sensor is the what is used by the NAVA mode of ventilation, which uses the principle called ERD as the trigger sensor, and this is electrical activity of the diaphragm. So in NAVA, which is the one of the most advanced modes of ventilator, so this utilizes the principle of the electrical activity of the diaphragm being sensed by a esophageal transducer to sense the patient's inspiratory effort, and in order to kind of signal to the ventilator to initiate a breath. So this is the newest form of synchronization, and this is available with the Mackay Servo-I ventilator. If you specially ask for this module, this can be provided. The only problem with the newer modes of synchronization are that when the patient has very poor respiratory drive, then they often come with poor backup mechanisms, or we may still have to fall back on the conventional modes of non-patient triggered modes of mechanical ventilation. So let us now discuss about the different types of patient-triggered ventilation. So principally, patient-triggered modes of ventilation denote all modes of ventilation where the ventilator tries to synchronize the ventilator breaths with the patient efforts as much as possible. So the different types include SIMV, or synchronized intermittent mandatory ventilation, assist control, or AC, which is also called as SIPPV, synchronized intermittent positive pressure ventilation. So assist control is the name given in Draeger ventilator, and SIPPV is the conventional name given in some other types of ventilators. If you see in SLE, this mode goes by the name PTV itself. The third mode is pressure support ventilation, which uses the principle of flow cycling. And we may use combinations of these modes like SIMV with pressure support or assist control with pressure support. So let us discuss each of them in detail. So first and foremost, we'll discuss SIMV. So in SIMV mode of ventilation, so imagine you have a baby who is spontaneously breathing. The ventilator mode actually provides only a fixed number of breaths that will be supported by the ventilator. And in case the baby is breathing at a rate which is lesser than the set ventilator rate, all the breaths of the baby are going to be supported by the ventilator based on the respiratory rate that you have set. And if the baby is breathing at, say, 20 breaths per minute and the SIMV rate is 40 breaths per minute, the ventilator will support all the 20 breaths per minute of the baby and will deliver 20 additional breaths every minute to achieve the set rate of 40. So 40 breaths per minute the baby will definitely have. And if the baby is breathing faster than the the set rate of the ventilator, say for example, if the set rate of SIMV is 40 breaths per minute and the baby is breathing at the rate of 60 breaths per minute, the ventilator will support 40 of the 60 breaths of the baby, and some breaths, say 20 breaths, will not be supported. So let us look at this figure again. So these are the spontaneous respiratory efforts of the baby, and this is how SIMV is going to look. So you can see that the SIMV rate in this case is slower than the baby's spontaneous breath. So not all the baby's breaths are being supported by the ventilator, but whenever it is supported, the beginning of the baby's inspiration is in sync with beginning of the ventilator's inspiration. So the trigger sensor detects the beginning of patient's breath and gives a signal to the ventilator. Hence, ventilator is synchronizing the inspiration with baby's inspiration. So we can see that ventilator inspiration and baby's inspiration are beginning at the same time. So in this particular first breath, there is actually no inspiratory asynchrony, but in the second breath of the baby began inspiration here, but the ventilator is still delivering expiration of the previous breath. So in this particular breath, there is inspiratory asynchrony still. Likewise, if you look at the expiratory synchrony, even in the supported breaths, so let us take the example of, say, the third breath. Here, the baby began expiration here. At this point of time, the ventilator is still in inspiration. So there is still expiratory asynchrony even with SIMV. So overall, if you look at inspiratory synchrony, it is present in some breaths, like in the first breath, third breath, and the fifth breath of the baby, there was inspiratory synchrony because these were all supported by ventilator inspiration. But in the second and fourth breath, there was no inspiratory synchrony. And expiratory synchrony is not present in any of the breaths because the baby seems to be having shorter inspiratory time than the ventilator breaths. So expiratory synchrony is universally absent, whereas inspiratory synchrony is present in some breaths and is absent in some breaths. So the algorithm with which SIMV works in most ventilator is like this. So if you have set a SIMV rate in the ventilator, say, let us say we have set 60 breaths per minute. Only that number of breaths will be supported by the ventilator. Now, if you have set 60 breaths per minute as SIMV rate, the ventilator typically divides this into two halves. So each breath is going to be 1 second because 60 breaths divided by 60 seconds. So one breath will be 1 second. Now, in this 1 second, the ventilator waits for the patient to initiate inspiration in the first half of the cycle. If the baby begins an inspiration in the first half of the cycle, like indicated here, and that effort is more than the trigger threshold, the ventilator will support that effort with a ventilator breath, like this. Now, supposing the baby did not breathe spontaneously in the first half of the respiratory cycle, that is in the first 0.5 second of a certain cycle, then the ventilator delivers a mandatory breath in the second half. So this is how typically SIMV functions. So if the baby initiates a spontaneous breathing in the first half of the cycle, that will be supported by the ventilator. If not, the ventilator will deliver a mandatory breath in the second half of the cycle. So all other parameters of this breath, for example, the I time, the PIP, the PEEP, the FiO2, as well as the flow, based on the type of ventilator, you may or may not be able to set the flow, but all these parameters are still decided by us, by the physicians. So we'll just look at this table to understand the different modes. So in SIMV, the rate is still determined by the ventilator or by us, by the doctors. So we are going to say that we'll only support these many breaths per minute. So if the baby breathes more than the set rate, some breaths of the baby are not going to be supported. If the baby breathes lesser than the set rate, all the breaths of the baby will be supported and few additional breaths will be given by the ventilator to reach the rate that we have set. All other parameters, I time, PIP, PEEP, and trigger, PEEP are decided by us, like exactly like in IMV mode of ventilation. And trigger is decided by the baby. So we allow the baby to actually trigger or initiate the ventilation, as we discussed in some breaths. Now, SIMV, as we discussed, comes with some problems where expiratory synchrony is not overcome at all and inspiratory synchrony is not completely achieved. So in order to make this better, the next step is SIPPV or assist control mode of ventilation. Here, the difference is we don't set the rate. The rate is decided by the baby. We only set a backup rate. So here, how many ever breaths the baby takes which cross the trigger threshold, they are all going to be supported by the ventilator breaths, provided the trigger in that breath is more than the threshold that we have set. So if the trigger crosses the trigger threshold, all those breaths will be supported by the ventilator. So if your baby is breathing at a rate of 70 per minute spontaneously, all the 70 out of 70 breaths, as long as they are above the trigger threshold, will be supported by the other parameters that we have set. So PIP, PEEP, I time, FiO2 and flow are still controlled by us. A control rate is still set in SIPPV or in assist control ventilation, which will come into play if the baby goes into apnea or if the baby goes into respiratory depression. So if the baby doesn't breathe at all, you will keep a backup rate. So let's say 30 breaths per minute is minimum what I want to give. That will be set as the backup rate. So there are two modes within SIPPV. One is an assist mode where all the breaths of the ventilator will be supported. And one is a control mode, which almost functions like SIMV, wherein if the baby doesn't breathe, the control mode will go into play. So let's see how the figure looks with SIPPV or an assist control. So we come back to the same diagram. So the baby has kind of initiated these many breaths, and you can see that all the breaths are supported by ventilator. This particular breath, which the patient initiated, was not supported by the ventilator because I hope you're able to see this effort is below the trigger threshold of the ventilator. So we still are going to set the trigger threshold. So if you're using a flow sensor, you will set your trigger threshold at say 0.2 or 0.4 liters per minute, like we discussed earlier. This particular breath probably was only 0.1 liter per minute. So it was below the flow trigger threshold that we set, and hence this is not being supported by the ventilator. So this is assist control. Coming back to this earlier figure, so this is the spontaneously breathing baby. The baby has initiated breathing 5 times. So if you are doing assist control mode of ventilation or SIPPV mode of ventilation, how many purple triangles of the ventilator breath do we expect to see? We expect to see 5 out of 5. So all the 5 breaths we expect to have been supported by the ventilator, because we are not controlling the rate. In assist control, we are only controlling the backup rate. So all these 5 efforts of the baby have been supported. Now, what is happening to the synchrony part? So inspiratory part, the baby began inspiration here, the ventilator also began inspiration. So you can see in every breath, the baby's inspiration is synchronized with the ventilator breath's inspiration. So there is complete inspiratory synchrony. However, expiratory asynchrony is still a problem. So if you see this breath, the patient began expiration here. The baby began expiration here, whereas the ventilator began expiration only here. So there is a difference in time point between the initiation of the baby's expiration and the ventilator's expiration, and hence expiratory asynchrony is still a problem even with assist control mode of ventilation because of the difference in the inspiratory times between the baby and the ventilator. So we discussed this table for SIMV. Let us do the same for assist control. So assist control, the rate is decided by, is it the ventilator or the baby? It is the baby. So the rate is decided by the baby. All the other parameters, the I time, PIP and PEEP are still decided by the ventilator, and the trigger is again decided by the baby. So we have kind of mostly overcome the inspiratory synchrony with assist control mode of ventilation, but it still comes with 2 compromises. One is when we support every breath of a baby who is breathing very fast. So if the baby is tachypneic and having a respiratory rate of 70 per minute, and if you use assist control mode of ventilation, of course, you achieve excellent inspiratory synchrony. But what is going to happen? You're supporting 70 out of 70 breaths with I time of say 0.4 or 0.45 seconds. automatically we end up compromising on the E time or the expiratory time. And hence, in some conditions, like for example, in meconium aspiration syndrome or in conditions where there is increased airway resistance, you may still have a problem of air trapping with assist control mode of ventilation. So this is one of the important problems. The other problem of assist control is because of the high ventilator breath rate, there can be significant hypocarbia or CO2 washout, especially in a baby who is tachypnic with normal lungs. This we see quite often in a baby with shock, in a baby with IEM, in a baby with metabolic acidosis, where the lungs may be relatively normal. When you start using assist control mode of ventilation, every breath of the baby is going to be supported by the ventilator, and hence the respiratory rate times the tidal volume is going to be quite high. The minute ventilation is going to go up, and in a baby with normal lungs, this can lead to significant hypocarbia. And whenever we see hypocarbia in the ABG as a reflex, we go back and reduce the rate. Remember, reducing the rate in assist control is not in our control. Even if we reduce the rate on the mode, we will only reduce the backup rate and not the real rate of the baby, because the baby is only determining the rate in assist control. So please remember, when you see hypocarbia in assist control mode of ventilation, we must only reduce PIP and not the rate, because rate is not something that we are controlling. And of course, the other problem that remains is expiratory asynchrony is still not overcome. So if you look at the flow scalar in a baby who is having air trapping, as you can see here, this is the inspiratory flow and this is the expiratory flow. So even before the blue line indicating the expiratory flow reached 0, the next breath has begun because of the short E time. And this indicates the presence of air trapping. It can also be seen with the flow volume scalar, where this is the inspiratory flow and this is the expiratory flow. And if there is air trapping, this line actually reaches here rather than reaching the 0 line. So the issue with both SIMV and assist control, which are both time cycled modes of ventilation, is that there is a phase of inspiratory hold. What is this inspiratory hold? Now, if you look at the pressure to time scalar and the flow time scalar in these two modes, it is going to look like this. So this is pressure versus time. So PEEP, PIP, and this is the I time and this is the E time. This is the pressure scalar and this is the flow scalar. So if you look at the flow scalar, the inspiratory flow reaches back to 0 flow and stays here for a while until the I time finishes in all the time cycle modes of ventilation. And this is a phase of 0 flow. So there is no flow further from the ventilator to the patient. The flow has already finished during inspiration. The patient's lungs are maximally inflated in the PIP, and the baby is not allowed to exhale or breathe out because the I time is still not completed. So this results in a phase of 0 flow during inspiration, which is called as inspiratory hold. This may come with an advantage that, the proponents of time cycle modes of ventilation say inspiratory hold is helpful because the patient's lungs are maximally inflated at the peak volume or maximal inspiratory pressure, peak inspiratory pressure, and this actually helps in gas exchange. But if you look at the proponents of flow cycle ventilation, they say it results in expiratory asynchrony because the baby wants to breathe out and we are not allowing the baby to breathe out. So this can result in an uncomfortable the baby trying to fight the ventilator. Now, why does this inspiratory hold actually occur in time cycle modes? So we must understand that when the inspiration of the ventilator begins in a time cycle ventilation, the airway pressure or the pressure at the proximal airway of the endotracheal tube is actually slowly rising up from the PEEP to the PIP. So it goes up to, say you are using a PEEP of 4 and a PIP of 20. As this proximal airway pressure goes up, the alveolar pressure at the beginning of inspiration is only at peak. Say it is at 4. And the ventilator began inspiration at the beginning of I time. So the peak pressure in the proximal airway is now rising from 4 to the maximal pressure of, say, 20. So there is a gradient in the pressure between the airway to the alveoli. So the airway pressure has gone to 20 and the alveolar pressure is still at 4. So this gradient of pressure 20 minus 4 results in the flow moving rapidly into the baby's alveoli. During inspiration, the alveolar flow will gradually increase. From 4, it is going to increase in steps to 8, to 12, 16. So this gradient keeps becoming lesser and lesser and lesser, pressure gradient between the proximal airway and the alveoli, until a point where it becomes 0, when the alveolar flow also reaches the PI. After the 0 flow happens, after this pressure gradient becomes 0, the flow actually stops, because both the alveolar pressure as well as the airway pressure have become equal. They have both reached 20, hence there is 0 flow. So this flow of 0 during the I time of the ventilator results in inspiratory hold. This is what may result in expiratory asynchrony. So we are trying to do away with this inspiratory hold by doing flow cycle mode of ventilation. So we use flow for cycling from inspiration to expiration rather than time in PSV, or pressure support ventilation. So this works on the principle that the cycling variable is flow and not time. So how do we actually do that? What we do is we determine or decide something called as termination sensitivity. This is the percentage of the peak inspiratory flow rate during a breath at which we want the ventilator to cycle from inspiration to expiration. So supposing during the breath, the peak inspiratory flow rate reached was 4 liters per minute. Say that is 100% of the flow rate. We keep the termination sensitivity at anything between 5 to 25% of this peak flow rate, at which we want the ventilator to cycle from inspiration to expiration. So supposing we have kept the termination sensitivity at 10%. The peak flow rate during the breath was 4 liters per minute. So 10% of 4 liters is 0.4 liters per minute. So whenever the inspiratory flow reaches 0.4 liters per minute, the ventilator will automatically cycle to expiration. And this is the principle of flow cycle mode of ventilation. So whenever we use PSV or flow cycle ventilation, we don't set the I time, but we set the termination sensitivity. Termination sensitivity implies the percentage of the peak inspiratory flow rate at which we want the ventilator to cycle from inspiration to expiration. And usually this number varies between 5 to 25%. So if you keep it at 5% instead of say 15%, the I time that the baby gets will be effectively longer, because the flow rate must come further lower in order to cycle to exhalation. If we set it at 25%, then the I time is going to become shorter and shorter. So this will be the difference in the pressure scalar and the flow scalar between time cycled and flow cycle ventilation. So on the left, you have the time cycle ventilation, where if you see the lower figure on the left side, we see the inspiratory hold or the phase of 0 flow. Whereas in flow cycle ventilation, because the ventilator moves from inspiration to expiration based on the percentage of peak inspiratory flow rate or termination sensitivity, we don't see a inspiratory hold. So what happens, this actually results in a shorter I time when compared to time cycle modes, and have effectively the mean airway pressure that we reach also might become lesser. So in PSV, by using flow cycle, the baby indirectly controls the I time. When the baby inhales fast, the I time also will become short, because peak flow is reached early, 15% peak flow is also reached early. Whereas when the baby takes a sigh breath or a slow inhalation, the peak flow is reached late, 15% of the peak flow is also reached late, so TI will be longer. So coming back to this table with PSV, who sets the rate? It's again the baby. So it's effectively like assist control ventilation. The only difference being assist control is time cycle and PSV is flow cycle. So the I time also in PSV is decided by the baby, because by regulating the percentage of the PIFR at which we want to change from inspiration to expiration, indirectly we are giving the control of I time to the baby. The other two parameters, PIP and P, are still controlled by the ventilator. And of course, trigger is also controlled by the baby. So in PSV, effectively, we have given 3 of the 5 main controls to the baby. And we still only continue to control the peak pressure, the PIP and the P. SIMV itself can be combined with pressure support, wherein SIMV fixed breaths are supported by the, as in lines as per the algorithm of SIMV. we can continue to support those number of breaths that have been set in SIMV, and the additional spontaneous breaths of the baby can be supported with pressure support. So when we combine these two modes, supposing you have a baby who's breathing at 65 breaths per minute, we have a set SIMV rate of 40 breaths per minute. The additional 25 breaths per minute of the baby will be supported by PSV. And this is how it will look. So you can see that the tidal volumes with PSV breaths will be slightly lesser. So this third breath is a PSV breath. So you can see that the tidal volume is actually lesser. So what does evidence say? We have so many now modes of ventilation. Is it actually proven that these patient-triggered modes of ventilation are better than the CMV mode of ventilation? So when we look at the forest plot of the Cochrane review, the significant difference that we can see is not in terms of hard outcomes like mortality or air leaks or bronchopulmonary dysplasia, but when we compare the assist control SIMV modes together versus CMV, we definitely see that the duration of ventilation is lesser with patient-triggered modes of ventilation, because you tend to give the baby more and more control over the trigger, the rates, as well as the eye time. So this reduces the work of breathing, and hence the overall duration of ventilation is lesser by 38 hours, which is quite a significant difference, almost 1.5 days shorter with patient-triggered modes of ventilation, although this does not translate into reduction in PPD. Now, alongside with this, we thought we'll also discuss the volume targeted ventilation. So, so far we have only been discussing about modes to improve the patient synchron or patient triggered modes of ventilation. Now, what about the control parameter? So we discussed that control variable can be either pressure or volume. That is a variable that determines the peak gas flow during ventilator breath. So this, if we use volume as the control variable versus pressure, it has been found that, volutrauma is definitely more injurious than barotrauma. A lot of animal experiments have shown that the tidal volumes are more injurious than the peak pressure itself. So controlling the volume during ventilation seems to be a very, very desirable thing, especially for neonatologists to do. And when we control volume, we also avoid inadvertent hyperventilation and hypocapnia, which is damaging to the baby's brain in the form of PVL and to the lungs in the form of increasing the risk of BPD. And this comes with the limitation that the typical adult form of volume control ventilation doesn't work well with newborns because of the limitations in the microprocessor technology, which make assessment or measurement of the small tidal volumes very challenging. So if you take the classical volume ventilation, it works on the principle that instead of controlling the peak pressure during every ventilation, say we set PIP, I want the peak pressure to be at say 20 centimeters of water in each breath. Instead of pressure, we try to determine the preset tidal volume that needs to be delivered with each breath. So we say tidal volume in an adult, say we want to achieve 500 ml per breath. So that becomes the control variable in each breath. Whatever pressure is required in order to achieve that volume is used during each breath. Right? But when we look at the typical volume limited ventilation, this is how the pressure volume loop is going to look. So the volume we have pre-decided, say this is the volume, and this is the preset, this is still the pressure limited ventilation, sorry. So this is the preset PIP. Now, when the baby's compliance of the lung slightly improves, with the same PIP, we are able to achieve higher tidal volume. Whereas when the compliance of the lung reduces, as seen in the purple color, with the same preset peak pressure, we are able to achieve only lesser tidal volume. So with typical pressure limited ventilation, the tidal volume varies with changing compliance. And this can be very confusing for us. So with each breath, the baby can achieve different tidal volumes, leading to very erratic ventilation and CO2 elimination. Whereas when the tidal volume is preset, we have determined that this is the volume that needs to be delivered in each breath. For example, for an adult, 500 ml is the set tidal volume. So when the compliance changes, the ventilator simply delivers the same tidal volume. When compliance improves, it uses lesser peak pressure, as you can see here. When the compliance worsens, it increases the PIP that is required. So it requires more PIP, but still ends up delivering the same volume. So we achieve constant tidal volume irrespective of the changes in the lung compliance. And this is possible by varying the peak pressure in every breath. And this offers a little scientific rationale because animal experiments by Dreyfus and his group have shown, as you can see in this figure, when animal rodent lungs were exposed to high pressure and high volume ventilation in the first bar, low pressure, that is negative pressure and high volume ventilation in the second bar, and the last one is high pressure, low volume ventilation. So high pressure was given with the ventilator, but the chest was trapped. So tidal volume did not go up. So the lung injury, as measured by different markers, it was least in the last group, that is in the high pressure, low volume ventilation. So it means irrespective of high or low pressure, if you use low tidal volumes, the lung injury is lesser. So this actually makes it more logical for us to try and control tidal volume during ventilation. But this has been always traditionally difficult because of the smaller tidal volumes in newborns, which are difficult to measure with the existing microprocessors, and because of the leak around the endotracheal tube, which are peritubal leak, because we use uncuffed endotracheal tubes, which makes it difficult to estimate the exact tidal volume. So these pitfalls have now been overcome by better microprocessors, better flow sensors, which measure even small decimal point tidal volumes, and by measuring the tidal volume at the Y piece of the endotracheal tube at the proximal airway itself and not at the ventilator end, which can result in imprecision and inaccuracy. But if we completely move to the traditional volume limited ventilation, like what is done in adult ventilation, the problem is that this can result in, if you look at the pressure scalar, this will result in a very slow increase to the peak pressure when compared to the pressure limited mode of ventilation, where peak pressure is immediately achieved. So this can be an issue with stiff lung when we are using the traditional volume limited ventilation with a stiff lung. The rise of peak pressure can come very slowly. And likewise, when you look at the flow time scalar in pressure limited versus volume limited ventilation, in volume limited ventilation, we see a plateau type of flow scalar. So the inspiratory flow in pressure limited mode will be reached immediately to the peak inspiratory flow rate, and then there is a decremental graph. This is called a fin-shaped flow scalar. Whereas in traditional volume limited ventilation, this results in a plateau shape or a very steady increase in flow. Typically, the baby or the patient requires high flow in the beginning of inspiration, and which this may not be delivered by the traditional volume limited ventilation, resulting in flow starvation. So, so we discussed the PV loop in the volume limited ventilation, and this is how it looks. You can see that when we also use volume limited ventilation, although we achieve same or constant tidal volume, there is no real control over the peak pressure. Sometimes it might be 12, sometimes the peak pressure might be 18, sometimes it might go to 25. So it may result in our lack of control over the deciding the peak pressure, especially in a lung which is very low compliant. The PIP required might jump up and down based on the changes in compliance. So in order to combine these two types of ventilation, pressure limited and volume limited ventilation, in newborns, we try to do a volume targeted ventilation where each breath is actually a pressure limited breath only, but that pressure is adjusted based on the volume reached in the previous breath. So based on the set tidal volume, we have a target tidal volume, and then we look at the tidal volume measured in the previous breath. Based on that, the PIP is adjusted in every breath. This is the principle of volume targeted ventilation. So it's not exclusively volume control ventilation also. It's not completely pressure control ventilation also. Every breath is actually a pressure limited breath. That is, it comes with a set PIP, but that PIP is not always constant. It varies. It is adjusted based on the tidal volume of the previous breath, and we actually decide the preset target tidal volume. So it's a kind of hybrid mode. It comes with different settings in different ventilators. For want of time, let's only discuss the VG mode, which is available in the Draeger mode of ventilator. So here the inspiratory pressure is based on the exhaled or the expired tidal volume of the previous breath. So VG is not a standalone mode, volume guarantee. It is either combined with SIMV or assist control or PSV. So what we do is we set the preset tidal volume, say we have a 1 kg baby and we keep the VG tidal volume as 5 ml per kg, which is 5 ml per breath. We don't set a PIP. We only set a PIP max or a P max. So this will limit the maximum increase in the PIP. So we don't allow PIP to go beyond the P max. All other parameters will be based on the underlying mode. Like in SIMV, we will be setting the E time, the PEEP, the flow, and the FIO. So in volume guarantee, it measures the expired tidal volume of the previous breath and alters the PIP of the next breath in order to maintain the VTE at a constant level set by the operator. If the VT is achieved is lesser than the set VT, then the PIP of the next breath is increased in order to achieve the VT, the tidal volume. But this increase should not be more than 3 centimeters per breath. So if we have set tidal volume of 5 ml and the volume that was reached in the previous breath was only 4 ml, the ventilator is going to increase the PIP that is delivered in this breath. So if previous breath it used a PIP of 15, it can increase it up to 16 or 17, but not beyond 18, not beyond an increase of 3 centimeters from the previous breath. If the VT delivered was actually higher than the set VT, then the PIP can be decreased, and decrease can be done very rapidly. So this is the volume guarantee mode, and this is the working pressure. So this is the average pressure the patient is needing, and this is the PIP limit. So we have set the targeted tidal volume. In this breath, the volume reached was lesser than the target. So you can see that PIP was increased in the next breath. Next breath, we were able to reach the target tidal volume exactly. So same pressure was continued for the next breath, but this time the tidal volume overshot. So here PIP has been reduced. So the benefits of volume guarantee are maintenance of a constant volume, tidal volume, and this can adjust for rapid changes in compliance, which can be seen post-surfactant administration or after clearance of lung fluid. So even if we sometimes have to ventilate a baby with the pulmonary edema and we used Lasix, pulmonary edema became better, compliance improves. The volume guarantee mode will ensure that we don't end up over-ventilating the baby. And there is automatic weaning or lowering of the PIP based on the volume that is reached. So if we were to combine PSV plus VG with volume guarantee with the set volume, of course, with PSV itself, the rate and the I time are decided by the baby. So if you combine it with VG also, PIP also will be decided by the baby. And we are only left with controlling the PEEP. There are other modes of volume targeted hybrid modes of ventilation like the VAPS, volume assured pressure support, that is seen with the VIP birth. And evidence shows that volume targeted modes of ventilation in general result in reduction of death or combined rate of death and BPD, as well as the rates of severe grades of IVH. So I think with this, I will kind of go to the bedside. So we will kind of have a bedside demonstration of patient triggered mode. I hope the ventilator is clear. So we'll, as we did last time, so this for any patient triggered mode of ventilation, this is the key, the flow sensor. So we discussed last time how we kind of calibrate the flow sensor. So while occluding both ends of the flow sensor with sterile hands, one does start calibration. It takes few seconds with zero flow to ensure that calibration is completed. So flow sensor must be calibrated for using any of the patient triggered modes of ventilation because this functions as the trigger sensor while we are doing PTV. Now, when we begin any mode of PTV, of course, we decide whether we want to use SIMV or PTV itself or PSV. SIMV, as we already discussed, is what we usually use very often. Here we set the respiratory rate, I time, P, PIP, and FiO2. The screen. So we kind of control all these parameters. In addition, in SLE, we can also control the rise time. So if we keep a smaller rise time, then we'll have sharper rise of the PIP immediately to the peak pressure. So it will become more and more like a square waveform. Whereas if you prolong the rise time, it will make it more similar to a sine waveform. So if you want to deliver maximal pressures, then you can keep the rise time short. So it will become more and more like a square waveform. We can always choose to combine SIMV with pressure support, and this is what we use. So if you want to support set breaths, so 40 breaths using SIMV and the additional breaths of the baby using pressure support, you can set the pressure support, the PIP of the pressure support here. Traditionally, it is set at around 60 to 70% of the PIP of the control breath, the SIMV breath. Then this is the trigger sensor. So this sensor is to be set at the required flow rate that is needed to be sensed as the trigger from the baby. So if you keep it more sensitive or at a lesser number, so if you keep it at 0.2 liters per minute, the flow sensor, the flow trigger becomes more sensitive. So even small efforts of the baby are going to be sensed as trigger. Whereas if you keep this more higher, it becomes more insensitive. You can see the trigger threshold moving up here. So traditionally, we keep it at the lowest possible trigger threshold at which we don't see autocycling in order to reduce the baby's work of breathing. So these three are the additional parameters. The regular parameters are here. So we see all the pressure time, the flow time, and the volume time scalars in the front screen. And the other additional parameters you can choose using the loops. So if you want pressure with flow or pressure, if you want the pressure volume loop and the flow volume loop you choose to have, you can opt for them. The ventilator will start displaying the pressure volume loop and this is the flow volume loop. So you can see this is inspiration and expiration. It is starting from the peak, going up to the peak pressure, and this y-axis represents the tidal volume delivered during every breath. Likewise, this is the flow volume loop. So this is the inspiratory flow, peak inspiratory flow, and end of the inspiration. This is the flow. It's coming down to zero flow. And this is the peak expiratory flow, and this is the flow at the end of expiration. So if there is air trapping, you will find the expiratory flow loop actually coming here instead of coming back to zero. So this represents the degree of air trapping. So coming back to the different modes of patient-triggered modes of ventilation, if you choose PTV instead of SIMV, so this respiratory rate in PTV actually automatically will become the backup rate. So this backup rate can be set at any number. You can keep it at 30 versus 40 or any breathing rate which you think is physiological for the baby. Now, supposing let us mimic the patient's inspiratory effort. So we are using, I'll go back to pressure time, flow time scalar for ease of understanding. So
let's say we are having baby breathing at a fast respiratory rate. You can show the test now. So this is similar to the baby breathing. Show the graphics. Now, because we have kept the baby on PTV, PTV is the same as assist controlled ventilation. So here we are not deciding the rate. Okay, the baby will be supported by any number of breaths that the baby initiates, provided the efforts are above the trigger threshold. So here we can see we have kept a backup rate of only 30. But because the baby is breathing multiple times above the trigger threshold is represented by the green line. So most of these efforts are above the trigger threshold. So what is happening? The ventilator is supporting all these breaths and is delivering a high respiratory rate. So you can see that all the breaths are supported. But if the baby doesn't breathe, now the baby stops breathing. Now the ventilator still continues to deliver the backup rate. The backup rate is set at 30 per minute. So 30 per minute will be still delivered with the PIP, PEEP and the I time that have been decided by us. Of course, the FiO2 and flow are also determined by us. So here you can see all the breaths are controlled breaths. Whenever the baby triggers breaths, these are represented by the orange line. So assist control, the difference from SIMB is that the rate control is given to the baby. Any number of rates that the baby wants to generate will be supported with the peak pressure, the PEEP, the I time and the FiO2 that are decided by us. Now if you go to pressure support ventilation, automatically it is going to ask you for this parameter called as termination sensitivity. So termination sensitivity, as I told you, is the percentage of the peak flow rate at which we want the ventilator to cycle from inspiration to expiration. So let's say we set it at 15%. All other parameters, it will still ask you, just like SIMB, what do you want the trigger to be? What do you want the rise time to be? What is the backup rate? PIP, PEEP, FiO2, you will continue to set. Automatically, when you went to PSV, the I time became Tmax. So it is telling every TI is going to be decided by the baby based on the termination sensitivity. So it will automatically cycle when 15% of the peak inspiratory flow rate has been reached. So during inspiration, when the flow rate reduced to 15% of peak flow, the ventilator will cycle from inspiration to expiration. It's not going to be depending on the time, but the time will be limited by the TI max. So maximum I time possible is 0.45 seconds. Within 0.45 seconds, the I time can be decided by the baby. So let us again say in PSV, let's see what happens. So let's see here, I've just frozen the loops. You can see that there is no inspiration hold at all when we do PSV. So automatically when the inspiratory flow reaches 15% of the peak flow, the ventilator cycles to expiration. So this is the principle of PSV in contrast to assist control mode of ventilation. And let's also see a little bit about volume targeted ventilation. So for this, I'll go back to SIMV. Now we are back to SIMV at a rate of 30 breaths per minute. Now here on SIMV, or for that matter, even with assistant with PTV and with PSV, you can add VTV as an additional option. So you long press VTV to first switch it on. Then you set the tidal volume that you desire. So imagine we are ventilating a 3 kg baby. We want the tidal volume to be 5 ml per kg. So let us set the target tidal volume at 5 ml per kg, which is 15 ml. So what is going to happen? The PIP now automatically became PIP max. So within this PIP of 18, whatever pressure that it takes to deliver this tidal volume of 15, the ventilator is going to use. So let's imagine the lungs become stiff. So I'm holding the lungs. So automatically the ventilator alarms telling it is not able to signal or deliver the tidal volume with the given PIP max. So what we should do is then increase the PIP max. We allow the ventilator to use a higher tidal volume. So we have set the target volume at 15 ml. The peak pressure, maximum peak pressure is 24. So with each breath, So even with peak pressures of 24, the ventilator is barely able to deliver the target tidal volume. That's why it is alarming to us. So it means it needs a higher pressure target. So once you increase the PIP max, slowly the tidal volume is becoming closer and closer to the target tidal volume. If it is still not able to deliver the target tidal volume, the ventilator will indicate an alarm to us that the tidal volume is low. So this calls for us to examine the baby for poor complaints, leak, or increasing the PIP max as desired. Now, if I were to reduce the tidal volume that is required to say 9 ml, the PIP that is used per breath automatically starts coming down. So you can see that the tidal volume also starts dropping down. It's coming closer and closer to 9 ml. The lungs are the same. Complaints has not changed. Now the tidal volume has come to 9 ml. So automatically there is weaning. We don't have to wean the PIP from 27, 25, 24, 16, etc. The PIP required is automatically coming down, and this is called as auto weaning. So this is one of the biggest advantages when we use volume targeted ventilation. So are there any questions? So if not, I think I thank everyone who has joined, and we hope to do a session on pulmonary graphics next Friday, which will be a part of the ventilation symposium. So thank you all for joining us.